Okay, hi. Today I'm going to talk about all of the nonfiction I read in 2025. So for me, this was like a very high nonfiction reading year. Usually I only read maybe like 10, and this year I read 22. So I want to talk about all of those and recommend them for the right readers. And so I'm going to break them down and talk about them in different groupings, kind of not by subgenre necessarily, but like more a little bit subgenre and vibe. So I'll be talking about memoirs, finance, history, cultural critique, and my personal favorite, investigative journalism. So we are just going to get right into it. So we're going to start with memoir. And the first one I want to talk about is a 2025 release, and it is The House of My Mother by Shari Franke. This is told through the perspective of Shari Franke, who was a child on the child vlogger channel 8 Passengers. There's a lot of discourse about this channel because one of the parents was charged with child abuse later on. And she, as an adult now, is talking about her experience growing up in a household where there was escalating abuse over time, where like her family became involved in a cult, and how that intersected with her life, and what it was like to actually have to participate as a child in these family vlogging situations. And I think it's a good book where to kind of ponder the ethics of the consent and what the boundaries are of acceptability, and if there are any, for child vlogging channels, or like, which is in some ways like the new child actor in terms of like lack of protections. I have a full-length video about this book. If you want to watch, I'll have that linked below. Overall, I really enjoyed it. It's a subject that I'm fairly passionate about, and so getting a first-person perspective of what going through that was like, I think is an important part of the current cultural narrative. Okay, the next one is Dinner for Vampires by Bethany Joy Lenz. So this is spun as life on a cult TV show while she was in a cult. So she was on One Tree Hill, which was a very popular CW teen drama. And she talks about her like life getting into acting and getting onto the show as a young actor, and her relationship with religion, and how that relationship with religion and like identity and belonging led in some capacity to her getting involved in a cult, and kind of the escalation of her relationships within that cult, and how it distanced herself from the cast while she was on that show, and also from her family and people around her, and how she eventually was able to leave. I watched One Tree Hill and was fascinated to read this book through that lens. It speaks to like this like underculture that sometimes happens within Hollywood around cults, and like this intense feeling of like trying to belong, and how things may look different on the surface than what's actually going on in someone's life. The next one is another 2025 release. This is Semi-Well Adjusted Despite Literally Everything by Alyson Stoner. Alyson Stoner is another celebrity, and this is, it's kind of like a blend in like between the previous two I talked about, where Alyson Stoner was a child actor, and she started when she was very young through dance, and kind of left her suburban Ohio life behind and went to Los Angeles with her mother, who was very intentional about making this her career. She recounts the stresses and pressures of being a child star, and like this intense pressure that's put on them to keep going, because you need to keep working, and you need to be the one that breaks through from child stardom to adult stardom. And there's a lot of pressure put on these children to be able to do that. Also, just the pressures of being around, being in an environment that's like not really made for children. She talks a lot about like not really having her own identity, and kind of masking her identity to belong to other people around her. She talks about her identity with her like gender and sexuality and religion, and the way that she was like manipulated financially, and also like what all of that work ended up leading to. I found the book very articulate in the same or in similar ways to I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. They both were kind of coming up around the same time in Hollywood through like kind of different lenses. I think that if you liked that book, you would also find Alyson Stoner's story interesting. Okay, as you can see that like a lot of these ones that I put in Memoir also kind of do have cultural critique elements, and that continues on with the next one, which is Asylum, a memoir and manifesto, and this is through the perspective of a Nigerian gay man, and the first two chapters or few are about his life growing up in Nigeria and like the work he got into and the fears, and the changing landscape of acceptance and lack of acceptance of queer people in Nigeria, and his eventual need to leave for safety. So he sought asylum in the United States and went through the asylum process. And he speaks about that process. He speaks about being in a detention facility in, I think, New Jersey. And then the work that he did with other people who are seeking asylum after he got out. He also talks a lot about belonging and identity both in Nigeria and in the United States as a Black immigrant, and the challenges of like finding different communities to fit into, trying to fit into the gay community as a Black immigrant, trying to fit into the Nigerian community as someone who is queer, and the challenges that he faced through time, but also looking at this through the lens of like what better could be done for people who are attempting to seek asylum, and really showcasing the challenges that someone faces in that position in the detention centers, and also trying to navigate the legal process when you came to this country seeking asylum, usually meaning you don't really have many resources available to you. And he talks about that as well through the lens of people that he met and befriended in the detention facility. Okay, the next one is Black and Female. This is an essay collection, and it is similar to Asylum, but like while Asylum was more chronological, this is essays, so they had like a little bit more focus and could kind of were not told in chronology. She is a author who is best known for Nervous Condition. She's from Zimbabwe. And in this, she talks about the intersectionality of Blackness and femaleness, but also being African, and how all those intersect as well, like the Blackness and the her femaleness in the landscape of Zimbabwe and in other places she's been, but also being Black and female and African in the more global context. She also talks about Zimbabwe's history through the lens of colonial rule, and the impacts that had on her life growing up and like the culture that she grew up into. Overall, it made me more interested, I think, to read her books, because she also talks about that writing process and trying to get publishers, and her books not being written in a way that was perceived originally by folks to be conventional enough to be published into like Western audiences. And knowing that Nervous Conditions now is such a famous work, I thought that was really fascinating. So looking forward to reading more of her books. The last one for this section is Careless People. This was published in 2025. And this will be the one that I think from this list I'm not as likely to recommend. So the author of this book worked at Facebook for many years. And it's supposed to be like a memoir of her time there, but like also an expose on the company. And I had a lot of challenges with this book. Number one, I think, and this is going to vary from person to person, but I found it very challenging to believe that she was as naive as she was going into working at Facebook, thinking that she could use that platform to make the world a better place through the lens of international relations, because that's what her background was in, and that she could do that through a corporation. I just find that extremely idealistic, and maybe that's just me being cynical, but I really found that kind of my perspective on her maintained its consistency throughout all of the stories she told in such a way where sometimes it felt like I wasn't sure if she was actually that naive or if she was trying to paint herself as that naive, because there was just a lot of times where she just ended up in situations that were either dangerous for herself, dangerous for her family, or her like going to a undeveloped country that had like a dictatorial regime in it while she was pregnant, and saying that she didn't understand why that would be an issue, but later on claims that she realizes that was problematic, even though her husband at the time begged her not to go. It's just, I don't know, there's a lot of like little things like that where I just I had a hard time with it. And then I think that the main problem that I had with this book is that like she never understands her own culpability within the organization that she is involved in. So it is an expose on Facebook where she doesn't really seem to take accountability for the actions that she caused in Facebook turning into Meta, and like their globalization tactics and their relationships that they developed with the governments around the world. That was something that she pitched as her role, and then it didn't go the way that she thought it would, because I guess she was under the impression that corporations are ethical. I don't know. It's just very, to me, it's painted very naively, and I can't believe that she doesn't understand her own culpability for the actions that Facebook and Meta took. Just another item is that on an editing level, there were multiple repeat sentences, so I just feel like this needed like an additional passover by an editor to get it into a spot where it was actually like ready for market. Okay, let's move on to finance. I'm not going to talk about these ones that much because I made a video dedicated to this that I'll link below. In that, I do like a lot bigger of a comparison between these financial books and like what I thought the pros and cons were for each one, and then giving like some of my own like non-financial advice about them. So I'll just go over them briefly. The first one is I Will Teach You to Be Rich. This one is sold as a 6-week program, and I do feel like that's like the lens you should look at it through. It's like really like how to set up your finances, how to find the right banks, how to find the right credit card. What are the very, very basics of like financial planning for your future and your retirement? If you already know a decent amount about finances, I don't think it's going to be super helpful to you, but for someone who like doesn't really know where to start, it has a lot of just like clear boundaries of like, this is what you do, then this is what you do. The next one is Millionaire Mission. This one is going to be my personal favorite of the bunch, but like I'm also looking at it through the lens of this is the author is one of the hosts of the Money Guys, a YouTube channel that I enjoy, and so I like their money philosophies and financial philosophies, and I align to them a lot more than the others. So he really talks through like his financial journey, and then he talks about what the Money Guys talk about on their channel, which is the FOO, the financial order of operations, and like how you would follow that order of operations. It's good for someone who already has a lot of like wherewithal and doesn't kind of conform to the pressures of getting into like an exorbitant amount of debt in order to maintain keeping up with the Joneses. So if you're someone who like doesn't need help getting, like, you kind of already got like your finances in order, and you just kind of need to know like where to allocate your money and like maybe like something to encourage you to save a little bit more for your retirement, I would say this book is the better one for you. And then there's Retire Before Mom and Dad by Rob Berger. By the way, all of these three are written by YouTubers. I should have said that. YouTubers that I watch in some capacity. And this one I would say is probably the one I would recommend the least in terms of beginners. I think that Rob Berger, for this book, he tried to go through like a beginner's lens, but I found, as someone who actually does like enjoy like following finances and like taking care of my own finances, I found this one still a little confusing at times, and I think that his channel itself is like the best for like people who are actually retired and are trying to like continue like allocate their money properly and like kind of determine like how much you can and can't spend and like how to like monitor your money better. But like in terms of the book, it's the one that I would recommend the least. Okay, we're moving on to history books. I'm going to start with Fever, Feuds, and Diamonds. This is written by Paul Farmer, and he is a more famous doctor for his work bringing medicine and medical attention to places that don't have much or any medical infrastructure. And this book, he tells through the lens of the Ebola epidemic that happened in Sierra Leone and like the surrounding countries. And his time, at least in part one of this book, his time being in Sierra Leone and like working through all of the challenges of getting funding and lack of like medical infrastructure and trying to get supplies in and trying to do quarantines and like how the government restrictions clashed with culture, the lens through which it was told through the media in terms of like impact and like the kind of like true danger of the virus. Part one, I think, was the best part of the book. Part two was a history, and it's very clear that he is not a historian. So I found this part really, really challenging to get into, and quite honestly, I read this, I think, in March, and like I've lost a lot of the content by this point. I think that in terms of telling Sierra Leone's history, that would be better left to an actual historian. And then so overall, I think like read part one if you want to read this, and I would skip part two and find something else if you're interested in Sierra Leone's history. Okay, now we're moving to the DRC for the next two books. So this one is the Lumumba plot. The tagline is The Secret History of the CIA and a Cold War Assassination, which I find a bit misleading because I really do think that this book I just saw some deer walking on the hill across from my house. This book is really about the DRC gaining independence from Belgium and the time before, like coming up to it, and how the independence was gained in quite a different way than it was for other African colonies in other African colonies with different relationships with colonial powers. And the original like person, Lumumba, who was put in charge, and kind of like his history and like background, and then the clashes between people in power within the DRC, but then also like the geopolitical landscape of this through the lens of the Cold War and like socialism versus democracy. Overall, I thought it was like a really like fast-paced narrative nonfiction that had a lot of really great information. I thought it was really fascinating and a great read. Okay, the next one is King Leopold's Ghost, which is also about the DRC, but like before the gaining of independence. This is about like when the DRC was originally colonized by King Leopold of Belgium, and how he did it, the way he kind of ravaged and devastated the land of its resources, and the terrible labor practices of the people, and the millions of people that lost their lives to his cruel rule, even though he never actually set foot there. And then it tells that kind of narrative, and then it tells the narrative of people who kind of figured out what he was doing and like really wanted him to be taken to account for his actions there, but through the lens of the times. I thought that it was a really well-constructed and fascinating book as well, and would also recommend, though I would recommend reading this one and then reading the Lumumba plot. Okay, my last one for this section is The Ghost Map. This is about cholera outbreaks that occurred in Victorian England, and physicians and others at the time that were trying to learn how the disease spread. It's quite short, and the book had an interesting concept and gave an account of something that I personally had never heard of before. It also painted the sights and the smells of Victorian England in such a way that was very visceral. So, like, if you're queasy to that sort of stuff, this might be a hard book to swallow. Talked about like the different philosophies about how germs and viruses spread, which is just interesting looking through a modern lens of how unequivocally wrong some people were and how long those incorrect assumptions of how these things worked lasted, because the right people in power had those ideologies in like a chokehold. While I enjoyed the book, I would say that the last two chapters felt pretty pointless, like and more specifically the conclusion. It was pretty clear that this book was written around the time of 9/11, because he kind of jumped from cholera outbreaks in Victorian England to bioterrorism as like the new form of terrorism, and how like you can't stop it. And it was just like such a leap. And 9/11 got brought up multiple times, and it felt like very out of place, and like just like he was trying to draw a conclusion that was very like current, and reading it 20 plus years later, it felt very bizarre. Okay, now we're moving on to cultural critique. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is Decolonising Language and Other Revolutionary Ideas. This is an essay collection, and the author is a very famous Kenyan author who wrote this book, and it was published, and I think within a month of its publication, he passed away. So part one of this is a group of philosophical essays about language and culture within Africa. And then part two, each essay really focuses on an author that he knew, an African author that he knew in some capacity, and is kind of just about them and their interactions, and maybe what he just thought of the person in some capacity. And like overwhelmingly, they were positive about like how these people have impacted African literature in a positive way. And he speaks to like the joy of telling that and making sure that these interactions and moments don't get lost to history. And it was interesting to read that, knowing the book just came out and he passed away. And if he hadn't shared those things, that they could, in theory, be lost to history, especially for the person that, when he talked about them on the opposite side, had already passed away. So I haven't read any of his fiction, and it made me want to read some of it. I do own some that were both written originally in English and in, I can't remember, Ngugi, maybe. I'm probably saying that wrong. I will put it up on screen. Okay, next one, another essay collection called Sex and Lies. It is very short. It is about sex and the lies around sex in Moroccan culture and society. Each essay is a woman's story of someone that the author met, and she weaves in her own thoughts and discourse around whatever that topic is that she wants to center the woman's story around. That included like laws, ethics, politics, current events. Overall, it was interesting. It was a lens into Morocco that I hadn't looked through before and would recommend that if you're interested in it. Okay, next one, I'll Go Speak. This was published in 2025. This is published by a online personality. I guess he's technically a TikToker. He'll put a picture up of him, like maybe you've seen his short form content. He'll talk about like a specific word and its origins in like a very snippy, excited manner. So this is a fairly meandering book about social media and language and how those two things interact. It's heavily informed by his own relationship with social media and being an influencer. I personally wanted to read it because I find linguistics and like the change of language over time to be very fascinating. But like the structure wasn't that great. It didn't dive super deep into any of the topics in a way that I was hoping it would. And sometimes he made some statements that I found to be like pretty large generalizations that I don't think would like hold up well. So yeah, overall it was like a fine book, but like I would say this book doesn't fully deliver on its promise in the subtitle. I think that he focused much more of the book on his interactions and his personal experience on social media versus the actual social media transforming language. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Okay, and the next one is Revolting Prostitutes. So this is co-authored by two individuals who are both sex workers. Mainly, it's a book about sex work and its intersectionality with other marginalizations. And that ultimately leads to a conversation about like what to do about sex work in terms of its like legal status and like the criminalization of it. So this one has a lot of facts in it, and it's also quite meandering. I didn't have a hard time following what was being written, but I had a hard time following how the things I was being told related to the chapter that we were involved in at times. Now, this book is quite beloved in its Goodreads ratings, so I think that I'm in the minority on not really liking it as much and not personally recommending it. I think that it's a good perspective and that it's an important perspective to have, like a nonfiction about sex work written by sex workers. I also think that it shared a lot of facts that I think were interesting and also important. But I think that there was a lot of argumentative styles in this book that lend to logical fallacy. So in terms of how the information and how the arguments were conveyed, even when I agreed with what was being said, it didn't feel like it was done in the correct way to get there. There were some straw mans and contradictions of how something was told between chapters that, like, as an editor, I would have wanted cleaned up a bit more. I also think that it's a book that is not going to change minds. So this is really for an audience of people who already maybe just don't know a lot about sex work and don't have like a negatively informed opinion. Maybe they're more neutral about it, or they're open to changing. I'm losing sunlight. They're open to learning. Okay, I was losing daylight, so we have a light on now. I think that's all I wanted to say about that book. The last category, my favorite category, I think the category I had like the most wins in, with the exception of memoir, is investigative journalism. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is Cobalt Red. This is a book about cobalt mining in the DRC. Cobalt is used to power probably things that you own in your own home, rechargeable batteries mainly. And it is about, the author intends to attempt to follow the supply chain back to the source. And where it's mined, if it's mined ethically. And he basically proves through an investigative work that is not possible. And that these clean supply chains that these large companies claim to have is an illusion. And he spends a lot of time in the DRC going through the country, telling people stories, trying to uncover like where the supply is coming from. There's mention of child labor, forced labor, sexual violence, children with no schooling, dangerous working conditions for children, pregnant women, men, lack of medical care for people who are injured in these very dangerous mines, lack of clean water, unpaid labor, no PPE to protect them. I think that as someone who benefits from this mining, it's an important book to read, and I would highly recommend it. The next one I'm going to talk about is Blood Diamonds. This Cobalt Red is clearly like the author was inspired from, it feels, Blood Diamonds, because this is another one like in the country, on the ground investigative journalism that happened, I think, like decades before in Sierra Leone on trying to follow the supply chain for diamonds. I do think that Cobalt Red is more successful than this book. For me personally, the tone is off through the whole thing. I didn't like the way that he talked about things. He makes a lot of bold statements that I don't think you could back up. Like, they just didn't really make sense to me. And this is another one from the list that was written at the time of 9/11, and he like interweaves it into the narrative. And in this one, there is more of a connection, so I can like follow the line of it a little bit better. Yeah, so there are a lot of reductive statements in this book that like make me just like kind of question like how valuable it is to read, but I also do think that it inherently speaks to atrocities of war and like extracting resources without considering the repercussions to the area that these things are being mined from, and that in the case of Cobalt Red, you really cannot tell if a diamond you are purchasing is a blood diamond or not. Okay, the next one is No More Tears. This is a 2025 release, and this book is an expose about J&J as in totality, so different arms of the J&J company. If you read the intro, he makes a lot of promises, and in my perspective, he keeps them all. I'm going to just rattle off some of the things that this talks about. So baby powder with asbestos being sold for over 50 years, Tylenol and acetaminophen being really close to the safe dose line as an over-the-counter, and acute liver failure incidents that have occurred because of it, antipsychotics being prescribed to the elderly for off-label use for dementia with no good data, antipsychotics being prescribed to children off-label to treat disruptive behavior, which can cause breast tissue development in boys and lactation in all children, blood-thickening drugs being sold for use with cancer patients that cause the acceleration of tumor growth, hiding data, fudging numbers, not publishing the data, lying to the FDA incompetency, shadow recalls, deadly birth control patches. It was a wild ride. It was very interesting to me. I love pharmaceutical exposés, so for me, one of my favorite reads of the year. On the topic of pharmaceutical exposés, I'm going to talk about another one, Bottle of Lies. This one is about the generic drug industry. particularly around the import of generic drugs into the US from countries with lower or no regulatory standards. So it discusses and critiques the approval process for a generic version of a drug within the United States. It explains or touches upon the issues with the geopolitical issues with regulatory bodies like the FDA trying to control the manufacture of substances for import into the US but don't occur in the US, and like how it's incredibly difficult to have the proper oversight over those. So it was very narrative focused in nature and how the story was told. It focuses on key individuals, including a whistleblower, an FDA inspector, a doctor who treats transplants, and overall really interesting look at the generic drug industry and the social and political pressures to approve drugs that may not be efficacious, and sometimes may be made by facilities that are not looking out for the best interest of the consumer. Another book that I loved and would highly recommend. Okay, next one is The Devil at His Elbow. This is a true crime. It is following the Murdaugh case, where a woman and her son were found murdered in their home, and the person responsible was the father and husband, who was also a lawyer. I first heard of this case on the YouTube channel Emily D. Baker. She is a lawyer and she followed the trial. I did not watch the trial. I was interested in it though, and so that's why I picked up this book. So this book chronicles the trial itself and the events leading up to it, but it also explores this 4 generations of this Murdaugh family dynasty, this family dynasty of lawyers in Hampton County, South Carolina. I really enjoyed that the author got commentary from both sides of the trial and had a lot of different perspectives that were conveyed within the narrative. It didn't feel like sided, if that makes sense. The format itself was very narrative in structure. It was very compelling. It was a very easy read. It started with the trial and then wove in the backstory of the 3 previous generations of Murdaugh men. And you see the ethics kind of change and morph and maybe get worse through time as the Murdaugh generations continue. But I kind of questioned if the current Murdaugh was actually the worst, or if modern times made his crimes more obvious, because it wasn't just the murder of his wife and son, it was also the stealing that he was doing from his clients and manipulating people, and just the types of cases he took on, and how he really wasn't protecting his clients a lot of the time and was stealing from them. While it touched on like racial terms and in like the historic parts, Jim Crow law, I think that there were like racial elements to the Murdaugh family and like the people that they're caretakers of their life, being folks of color. And I don't think that like that was like mentioned but not explored much. But like I also think that this might not have been the correct book for it. So it's only like a very minor critique. But I think that I remembered to talk about all 22 books. So that is everything that I read. Those are all the books, those are all my recommendations. Overall, I think it was a good nonfiction year. And I would love to hear about nonfiction books that you would recommend to me based off of these lists. I'm always into a new nonfiction read. So that is all I got for this video. So until next time, happy reading.